Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just a moment. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Justice40, the whole of government approach to the whole of government initiative to ensure that vulnerable communities benefit from federal investments in climate and clean energy. It's a mouthful, but the bottom line is that in the last 9 months, we have seen historic investments in the nation's infrastructure and climate future. Together, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed last November and the Inflation Reduction Act passed in August will reduce toxic pollution, increase access to clean water, cut planet warming pollution, accelerate our clean energy economy, and so much more. And even better, President Biden has committed to ensuring that at least 40% of the overall benefits from federal investments in climate and clean energy flow to disadvantaged communities. We are delighted to have Lashelle Johnson with us today. Lashelle is the State Equity Policy Director at the League of Conservation Voters, and they will share with us today how the Justice40 Initiative guides the equitable implementation of federal climate and clean energy investments. My name is Kathleen Neal, and I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from our speaker first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send your questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you, and I'll keep track of them and ask them of Lashelle following the presentation. We ask that you not message our speaker directly, as we want their focus on the presentation, not the chat box. Please message Will Sedlak if you have any technical difficulties. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you all for joining us, and Lashelle, I will turn it over to you to kick things off.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathleen. Hey, everybody. I will go ahead and share my screen with y'all, and then we'll get started. So hi, hello. I think you can see my screen. I am Lashelle Johnson, the State Equity Policy Director at the League of Conservation Voters National Organization. I serve as the primary policy contact for our 32 state leagues. I work mainly on the implementation side, both state and federal, which is why I'm excited to be talking to y'all today. So today we are going to be talking about Justice40. What we're going to do today is broken into 3-ish parts. I'll talk about the Justice40 Initiative, what it is, talk a little bit about when it applies, and then spend some time discussing what that means for Maine. I won't talk a ton about the Maine specific impacts because the lovely folks at Maine Conservation Voters are your local experts. And then, as Kathleen said, we'll open up the floor for questions. So if that sounds good to everyone, I will get started. Also, apologies if you hear the dog trying to break through the door behind me. He's very excited to be part of this conversation too. All right, so getting started, getting right into it. What is Justice40? So in January of 2021, President Biden issued an executive order. That order was called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. It established the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy, the Civilian Climate Corps, which you've probably heard of, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, or WEJAC, and a number of other initiatives, including Justice40. So Justice40 itself is a whole of government effort to ensure that federal agencies work with states and communities to deliver at least 40% of the overall benefits from relevant federal investments to disadvantaged communities. The initiative aims to begin redressing the high levels of pollution, chronic disinvestment, lack of access to capital in communities of color and low-income areas that have been driven by discriminatory environmental, housing, infrastructure, and economic policies. The initiative aims to direct investment benefits to disadvantaged communities from programs that fall into one or more of the 7 categories that you see on the slide. Those investment areas are climate change, clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transportation, affordable and sustainable housing, training and workforce development related to the other 6 areas, remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, and critical clean water and wastewater infrastructure. Now, before I go on, I did want to take just a second to talk about what investment benefits are. As you may have caught in the purpose of Justice40 and what I've been saying so far, the initiative is aiming to drive investment benefits to disadvantaged communities. Rightfully, you might be asking, what is that? What is an investment benefit? What does that mean? Investment benefits include direct investments, indirect investments, and program outcomes that positively impact disadvantaged communities. The idea here being that delivering investment benefits rather than just direct investment places an emphasis on strengthening the programs to maximize community benefits and reduce the likelihood of harms. In the interim guidance that the administration put out, they listed a ton of examples of what an investment benefit could look like. I wanted to include a couple here. The ones I pulled out were reduced exposure to harmful emissions related to transportation pollution, improved access to clean, reliable, and high-frequency transportation, reduced legacy pollution in environmental justice communities, increased availability of clean energy and energy efficiency programs for low-income households. There are a ton more examples of what potential investment benefits could be. Most agencies have sent in plans to name what those investment benefits could be for their own programs that they run. The other thing that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on here is the term disadvantaged communities. As you've likely noticed, I've been using it a lot. It's been written up here a lot. The language disadvantaged communities is used in a number of federal programs and is the language that's used in the executive order for Justice40 and the subsequent Justice40 guidance. Environmental justice partners and community members have noted that this isn't the perfect terminology, and it does leave room for interpretation and might have a bit of lack of nuance. You might be more familiar with a more specific terminology like frontline, fence line, historically disinvested, overburdened, or underserved communities. But I did want to just note, for the purposes of today, I will be using the language disadvantaged communities because it is the language that the executive order uses and is the language that the federal government will be using. So if you're looking into this, you'll be hearing that term, but wanted to be clear about why it's being used today. The definition for disadvantaged communities that I'm using is communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. And now that we've talked about what a disadvantaged community is and why we're using that language, the next step is, well, how do we know what a disadvantaged community is? How do we identify those communities around us? In the interim guidance for Justice40 that was published by the Office of Management and Budget, the Council on Environmental Quality, and the National Climate Advisor, federal agencies were encouraged to use the methods that you see here to identify disadvantaged communities. Those being defining community as either a group of individuals living in geographic proximity to one another or a geographically dispersed set of individuals where either type of group experiences common conditions. And then for the disadvantaged part of that, Agencies have been encouraged to consider appropriate and relevant data, indices, and screening tools that are based on a combination of variables, including the ones listed on the slide, like high transportation cost burden, low income, high persistent poverty, lack of access to healthcare. There are a lot of indices. This isn't an exhaustive list that federal agencies were encouraged to consider. And as you probably realize just by this entire slide of information, identification of disadvantaged communities is difficult, and leaving it on an agency by agency basis could have led to inconsistencies. So to make the identification of disadvantaged communities more streamlined and consistent across federal agencies, the Council on Environmental Quality launched a climate and economic justice screening tool, which is a web-based mapping tool that agencies and the public can use to identify disadvantaged communities in their area. And just a little bit about that tool. The Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, or CJEST, uses census tract data to identify disadvantaged communities. Under the tool's parameters, a community is identified if the census tract is above the threshold for one or more of those environmental or climate indicators that were on the last slide, that giant list, and additionally meets the threshold for income or higher education. And just so you have an idea of what that tool looks like, maybe if you wanted to play around with it later, I pulled down the disadvantaged communities map for Maine. The shaded areas you see are what the tool identifies as disadvantaged communities based on the data and indices that it uses. Those would then be communities who would be prioritized under Justice40. So now that we're talking a little bit about applicability, I will mainly use the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 to do a little thought experiment about how we apply Justice40, and then I'll sneak in just a little comment about the Inflation Reduction Act that was just passed in August. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about what's in this law. It would take another couple of hours, and I respect your time. But I do want to use it as a basis to talk about what Justice40 looks like in practice, so it's not just theoretical. So last November, if you'll remember, Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This law provided $550 billion in new spending, much of which was for things like public transit, power and water infrastructure, railways, electric vehicle charging, pollution cleanup, and climate resiliency. And as of July, $497 million in funding from that law has been announced and sent to Maine for over 45 different projects. This year alone, Maine will receive more than $393 million for transportation and $68 million for clean water. That's not all of the funding that will be sent to Maine from this law. It will take years to implement, so there will be years of funding. But I did want to highlight what's actually gotten here so that we can talk about what this means in a Justice40 lens. So the administration, when this law was passed, the administration released guidance for how to apply Justice40 to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act specifically. And it has been up to federal agencies to identify relevant programs based on the buckets that we talked about at the beginning, and then announce those programs that apply to Justice40 to the public. So if we're going to do a thought experiment thinking about how much money has come into Maine from this act, let's take the clean water funding. So $68 million has come to Maine for clean water. Most of that has been for lead pipe replacement. So when we're talking Justice40, we want to be thinking about what the investment benefits might be here and what the intended outcome of the program or project might be. In this case, the outcome would be lead pipe replacement. So that would lead to cleaner drinking water for residents. The benefit of a lead pipe replacement program would be getting your lead pipes replaced and not having lead in your drinking water. So when we're talking about Justice40, we want to look at that disadvantaged communities map and see if at least 40% of that benefit, your lead pipes being replaced and having lead-free drinking water, has been delivered to those communities. And this is where I slip in the little tiny section about the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, I'm not going to talk super in depth about it. It's brand new, and a lot of it is over in tax credit land, which I could talk about for hours, but we don't have hours. So the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law in August, and it works in concert with the infrastructure investments made in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that we just talked about. I want to say just for a moment here that the Inflation Reduction Act will lower energy costs. It supports good paying clean energy jobs. It will make electric vehicles more accessible, reduce air pollution, and support rural opportunities, all of which will require a Justice40 framework and will be held to the standards that we've talked about. It will be incumbent on agencies to ensure that at least 40% of the investments from this act are going to disadvantaged communities. Because at its most basic, Justice40 is a set of principles and standards that federal agencies are being held to, and it applies to all of the climate provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's my little IRA aside. So I just want to talk a little bit, we'll end here after this, but I want to talk a little bit about what's happening now and how states have been slotting into this conversation about Justice40. So on the federal level, the administration directed federal agencies to identify relevant programs and publish guidance on how they were going to implement Justice40. Most federal agencies published their updates in July or August of this year, so fairly new, fairly recent. Federal agencies were also tasked with identifying ways to strengthen the applicable programs in order to maximize benefits to communities. Federal agencies were also supposed to submit a plan to the Office of Management and Budget on what their strategy for Justice40 was. And then finally, a lot of agencies have been adding staff and sometime entire offices and units to implement Justice40 and oversee the historic investments that we quickly went over a moment ago. At the state level, it's a little bit more interesting and more nuanced. For the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that passed last year, the administration itself and some states have appointed people called infrastructure czars. These are people who are responsible for connecting federal agencies to state agencies and legislators and other stakeholders to shore up the implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, ensuring people are at the table, communities have a voice, that sort of work. Other options that states have been utilizing to ensure that there's a state process and infrastructure in place to get the federal dollars have been creating environmental justice committees and councils to review whether Justice40 is being adequately met in program delivery for federal projects. Some states have created and passed their own laws that mirror Justice40. The benefit of this tactic being it creates a statewide process and precedent for directing funding to disadvantaged communities. I'm sure there are tons and tons of ways that people can slot in on an individual level and ensure that historic investments are reaching the communities who most need them and have been most burdened by environmental racism and climate change. The Equitable and Just National Climate platform is a great place to go if you're just trying to get involved generally, but the stellar team here at Maine Conservation Voters definitely can tell you how to get involved at the state level. So thank you for letting me talk your ear off for a little bit, and I'm happy to pass the mic back to you, Kathleen, and we'll get started on questions.
Thank you so much, Lashelle. I really appreciate you cutting through a very complicated set of rules and funding requirements and giving us a great foundation to build on and see what those investments are going to look like here in Maine. Just so everyone knows, you will later this afternoon get a follow-up email with the link to the recording of this program and a couple of resources to follow up, including that map that will help you drill down and see which communities in Maine have been identified as disadvantaged communities based on that publicly accessible data set. I want to get right into that though, because there's a lot there and there's a lot that's not there. And so I'm curious about what kind of data was used in that that's to develop that screening tool, and is it the final word on which communities qualify? Who's checking the math on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is a great question. So the map does use publicly available, nationally consistent, is what they call it, data sets. There is an in-depth methodology that they use to create this. It was created out of some guidance from the WEJAC that we talked about, and it uses census tract data. If you know anything about census tracts, a lot of people wanted it to be at the census block level. It's a little bit smaller, a little bit, you can drill down a little bit further, but nationally, what is available consistently is census tract data, so they use that. We did talk a little bit about some of the indicators that the WEJAC suggested that federal agencies were using. That data was used to incorporate here. The one call out, and I think this is the one big call out, is that they don't use race. Race is not utilized here at all. Indigenous communities, like entire tribal communities, are utilized in this set, but like on a tribal nation basis. So I think that that's probably the biggest flag in this, is that a lot of communities are meeting the thresholds for the other climate indicators because of the way that environmental racism and like legacy pollution works. So if we're talking about like where is legacy pollution, it's usually in communities that have a greater number of people of color in them. So at the moment, I personally, and speaking for myself here, it's not as big of a flag for me at this present moment, but moving forward, when we're talking about like tracking and hopefully as things are getting better, not using races is a big flag that I think everyone should be aware of.
That's really interesting, because on the slide that you put up that had some of the criteria, wasn't there something about racial differences or something in the federal government's proposed, like, here's what you might want to think about?
Yeah, so WEJAC's recommendations, one of them was around race, yes. And federal agencies are still encouraged to use the interim guidance for their own mapping and identification of disadvantaged communities. The argument from CEQ in building this was that inputting race on as one of the indicators for the tool itself, they would be opened up to a lot of lawsuits. And then the tool would be basically put in stasis and not able to be utilized. So they decided not to do that. There was a very long comment period. But yeah, that is a flag.
Okay. I appreciate, I feel very reassured by your explanation of how a lot of communities that might qualify based on race are going to qualify based on other indicators right now. But I do just, yeah, I share that flag. And if we're not explicitly talking about race equity, then we're explicitly ignoring it at some level, which doesn't seem like the point of this program. Which actually, is an interesting, like maybe I want to get into all the weeds and all of the, who we're talking about and what counts and how the money flows and all of that. But maybe we should back up just a second and say, where did this program come from? Is it something that President Biden had talked about on the campaign trail? Is it something that was responsive to environmental justice communities advocacy, and is the name just obvious, or tell us, where did Justice40 come from?
The easy high level answer to that is that New York State had a law that has a lot of these parameters and does this work. So that was the model for this program. That's the easy, quick answer I can give you.
Love it, love it. And so then it was established early on and will apply. I know we were using the Infrastructure Act and Inflation Reduction Act as sort of hooks for this conversation, but does Justice40 apply to all federal investments or only a subset?
So Justice40 applies to what they call covered programs. A covered program is a federal government program that makes investments in one or more of the areas that we were talking about. So climate change, clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transportation, affordable, sustainable housing, remediation, critical clean water, wastewater infrastructure. I'm forgetting one, workforce development. So it does apply to federal government programs that are doing work and investing or that have investment benefits in those areas. There aren't a ton of laws at the moment that have just been stood up. But like all of the drinking water revolving funds, like all of these programs that have existed in the past, but are getting more and renewed funding through these giant climate investments, like they're covered programs. So it's not like it's siloed to these two big laws. It's more a program by program basis. So it works on a very much like an agency by agency basis.
Gotcha. And it applies to, they're federally funded programs, but they're getting implemented at the state level and also municipal and tribal levels, or just state?
Yeah, I think this is where the fun comes in, at least for me as a person who likes state policy. So the interesting thing about Justice40 is that it is federal program. So it covers federal government programs. A lot of federal programs are implemented at the state level. Some of them go directly to municipalities. Some of them are specifically, like the Department of the Interior has a lot of federal programs that are just for tribal governments. So there's a lot of implementation breadth here. I think the linchpin is just that it is a federal government program. Where it's implemented doesn't change whether or not Justice40 applies. It's the genesis or the inciting incident for all of my English nerds out there.
I love that. And so that's the what, or that's the where, but there is still this question. It feels fuzzy to me about who qualifies and who's tracking that. Is there a scenario in which, a state program to replace lead water pipes has to prove that 40% of those pipes end up in the homes of disadvantaged people, or is it community-wide? If they can't prove it, does the money go away? How does this actually work?
That's a great question. So federal agency heads are responsible for calculating the benefits, and they are required to report to the Office of Management and Budget, who you've probably heard me say 1,000 times. The agency heads have to develop the stakeholder engagement plan, a methodology, target benefits, and identify a percent of benefits that have been directed to disadvantaged communities. So that is all on the federal agency to do that work. They also have to report the percent of benefits that have had an unknown direction and the percent of benefits that have not been directed to disadvantaged communities. So it is incumbent on the federal agency to do that work. The other way that the administration has been handling this has been by creating a Justice40 pilot program, which just means that they identified 21 programs that, for the most part, already existed or were like getting stood up very quickly. They identified 21 programs to go in depth with. So they're doing a lot more work in order to like lay the groundwork for all of the rest of the programs on what this looks like. But yeah, all of that to say, it's incumbent on the federal agency to track and report the benefits. They can obviously include reporting requirements in their grants to other entities, but the methodology is upon them. Like the Department of Energy's programs, for example, require a Justice40 plan and application. A lot of them do, or some of them have been requiring, like as part of the application, a plan development proposal for how the grantee is going to implement Justice40.
Okay, that makes sense, because I was starting to go to a wait, if the federal government is responsible for tracking this, but not for implementing those programs, how does that work? How does the record keeping all line up? But it sounds like the federal government is responsible for requiring the implementing agency, whether it's state government or tribal government or municipal government, to have a plan to prove that they're meeting these. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's like part of the purpose for why some states have hired infrastructure czars for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, because they're doing a lot of that connecting work of getting like a federal agency head and a state agency head in the room together to make sure that they're having conversations. But yet not all of the investments that are coming down are going through like a state or a municipal government either. Some of them are directly coming from the federal government, so they have a little bit more oversight on the way that they're reporting. But yeah, there's a lot of like communication that is being stood up, which is why some of these agencies are like standing up entire offices and units and hiring people to make sure that this is implemented in an equitable manner and that they're able to track that the benefits are going where they're supposed to go.
And that burden of staffing would be at the federal level. I mean, I'm just going to a question about, you know, we have some funded positions in state government that are vacant right now. How does a state that is not fully staffed, or perhaps chooses not to invest in a infrastructure czar, a Justice40 lead, does that mean they're not going to, and they won't get those federal funds, or what's the consequence at that point?
Also another great question. I don't know that there are set consequences. The one thing I will say for like state capacity, because that is a really big issue of knowing that this is huge. There's huge amounts of funding that are coming down, like unprecedented amounts of money that are coming to states, that are flowing into states. So one of the ways that if capacity is an issue that a state wants to address and doesn't necessarily want to not address, like there are technical assistance grants and technical assistance programs that, because the federal agencies have been like given more money and have been staffed up, they have the capacity to come in and help until states are able to do some of that work. But yeah, it is complicated, and I don't know that there's a specific consequence at the moment. I think that's incumbent on the federal agency to determine what the Justice40 reporting requirements are, and then program by program decide, like in their granting process or in their funding process, however it may come down, it is incumbent upon them to decide some of those things.
Okay, so this is a work in progress, right? This is a building the plane while we're flying it moment, which I guess is how all the best things come about. I want to just tease apart two words that we've used. I know I have a tendency to use them interchangeably, and I don't know if they are interchangeable. Benefits and investments. When we talk about 40% of benefits, 40%, is there a difference there? How do we tease those apart?
Yeah, so I think the verbiage used by the administration is investment benefits. And the term investment benefits includes direct investments, which is like money in, indirect investments, and program outcomes. So a lot of like the minutia in the word benefits includes money. It includes like staffing and capacity, and it also includes like legitimate program outcomes, like what is the outcome of this program that we've stood up. So yeah, investments and benefits aren't fully interchangeable, but we've smushed them together to mean three separate things.
Fair enough, fair enough. And then is it possible that if we lean more heavily on one side of that benefit investment equation or the other, that changes who qualifies or how things are getting counted? Or am I overthinking this at this point?
Maybe a bit of both, because I think there's a possibility for things like that to happen. But again, like I keep saying it, I feel like constantly over and over, it is incumbent upon the federal agencies to, like, they had to go through an entire process of determining what the programs were that applied, like what a covered program. So like the Department of Energy had to go through their entire program list and determine what programs applied to Justice 40. And then after they've done that work, then they go through those programs and determine, like they make their plan for how they're going to implement Justice 40. And it is an agency by agency, case by case basis. Like the Department of Transportation was on it immediately. They had a lot of stuff out by January. So yeah, it really is how fast the agency is and how well staffed an agency is. Like what is the capacity for them to even determine some of this?
It's a good case in point of how important our civil servants are, right? And how the folks who keep government actually running are doing such important work, and we see the results in who's got full capacity and who doesn't at this point. Going back a little bit to who qualifies under the Justice 40 umbrella, our states, and knowing there's a little bit of fuzziness here, but that tool from CEQ, certainly a great starting point. But could a state or a municipality say, we looked at the tool, we're not using it because we've actually done some of our own work, and here are the communities that we identify as really important to meet the needs of this, overburdened and underserved. And is that okay? Is there a process where you could say, like, based on our on the ground definitions, we're addressing disadvantaged communities, or does it have to fit a national definition?
So at the moment, there is not a national definition. So that is wibbly wobbly. Everything about this is wibbly wobbly. It's so new. But the guidance that was issued by the administration was that federal agencies should consider appropriate data, appropriate indices, and appropriate screening tools. The CJEST isn't the first economic or environmental justice screening tool that has existed. There have been others. The guidance was to help direct focus and ensure that agencies weren't forgetting some of these important indices. So they named more, but it's not an exhaustive list that the that the administration provided. With that said, I think, again, one of the benefits of having these people who are appointed to talk to the federal agency heads and the state agency heads is they can do some of that work of getting everyone in the room and talking about, we're using these definitions, we are using these communities. Does that still, like when we are trying to apply and when we're trying to do the work of getting shovels in the ground, will that still be, like, are we going to meet our grant requirements? Because a lot of the money is coming through grants. So there's naturally going to be some reporting requirements and things that people need to meet. But then you have things like state revolving funds where the funding just comes directly to the state and is allocated by the state. So having someone in place to connect the people who need to be connected so that they can have those conversations, I think is really important. But at the moment, I would say the way that I read the guidance is the use of appropriate data, appropriate indices, and appropriate screening tools leaves that sort of margin for error, because the CGEST is a national screening tool that uses nationally consistent data. That doesn't mean that there isn't better data for Maine, and there isn't better information, there isn't more appropriate indicators, and there aren't more appropriate screening tools when you're looking at your state specifically. Rambling answer for all of these
No,
things.
that really helps. And actually, I know we have on the call with us today, Jessica Scott, who is a senior climate advisor with the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation and the Future. And she's done a ton of work to help Maine figure out what are those appropriate indicators, and how do we figure out what this means in Maine? And Jess, thank you so much for being on the call today. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the work that is akin to Justice40 in terms of making sure that Maine's climate action plan benefits all Maine people.
Thanks, Kathleen, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to join this Lunch and Learn. Justice40 is an area that I have worked on since I was part of the New York team in the governor's office there that created the initiative, and then came to Maine at the same time that the implementation timeline is kind of affecting all of our states. So this is a subject area that is near and dear to my heart. There is a fair amount of work happening in Maine already that I would say is in parallel to the Justice40 initiative, and some that is directly in alignment with Justice40. In parallel, I just put the work of the Equity Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council. Many of you have been involved in that work or have followed it over its time, but the Equity Subcommittee last year developed a set of recommendations to align the state's climate action plan with achieving equitable outcomes for all Maine people. That work is still underway with a final report from that subcommittee expected to the Climate Council early next year. I believe that you'll see in that report a number of equity metrics that align very much with tracking investments in disadvantaged communities. The Equity Subcommittee was tasked with developing metrics, things that we could measure and monitor to talk about the distribution of benefits or the distribution of climate impacts on Maine people. So I think you'll see a lot of work out of that committee that is reflective of the kind of same directive and intent of Justice40. Additionally, of course, our agencies have been receiving direction from their federal partners about Justice40, about incorporating it proactively into grant applications to these new federal funding sources, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and now the Inflation Reduction Act. And there are many requests and kind of competitive and formula funding applications to address equity, both at the design of a program and then also, as we've been talking about today, in the distribution of benefits of any program that is funded out of those sources. So our agencies are currently thinking through their compliance with Justice40 and following the guidelines that we've reviewed today from their federal agency partners and from the White House. Finally, however, this data question is real. What data really distinguishes between Maine's communities? We all know that Maine has large rural areas that are very sparsely populated. It has very small island-based communities that are not captured well at a census tract level, and that a lot of nationally consistent data is just not sufficient to talk about differences between Maine communities. And so we are currently looking at that. We're looking to see where Maine has access to better data than is provided at the federal level, where census block level data might be more appropriate, or where kind of a Maine specific definition that's already in use, perhaps at a variety of different programs and agencies, may be more appropriate than the federal level. I'll say just two things in conclusion. First, the federal government has really been recognizing states' leadership on this data, and they note that if where a state has a reason to better distinguish a disadvantaged community from another community, a state's data will, in most instances, as long as it's well-founded, trump the federal data set. So we can always use state definitions at this time where there's better data at the state level. And the second thing is that there is another legislative directive related here. You may recall, if you follow everything that the legislature does around data, that a bill called LD 1610 passed the legislature last year and was resourced. This bill, just directing you towards it, establishes some new positions in the state economist's office to better collect and make available demographic and economic data across the state of Maine. And so that, of course, is the underlying data that distinguishes disadvantaged communities at the federal level. Having that data accessible within a Maine context will be informative to this effort. So a lot going on. Really appreciate this lunch and learn. And I turn it back over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Jess. It's just fabulous to have both of you on this call, and Lashelle to get the big picture of what implementation looks like across the country, and then Jess to be able to go deeper into what's happening here in Maine. It's really encouraging and really interesting to think about that interplay. So I'm curious about whether states are having conversations with each other, to say, here's what we're doing in Maine, what's going on in Nevada, and how, is there an avenue to share experience, expertise, successes, failures, all of those good learnings? Lashelle, are you aware of any of that?
Oh, that's an incredible question. I don't know that I'm aware of any regional initiatives. I do know the Northeast talks to each other a lot more than the rest of the country, though. So I wouldn't be surprised, but Jessica might have a better idea if that's already happening.
I think that everyone is very excited about all the federal funding coming through IIJA and through the IRA bills. And because of that, a number of regional membership-based or nonprofit organizations have been convening conversations that are really focused on those funding opportunities for states and on how states can most successfully, competitively access those funds. So so there are a number of venues in which this is happening, though they're not formal venues related to Justice40. They're not formally convened, for example, by the White House CEQ. The U.S. Climate Alliance states are convening around this and really thinking about how the intersection between climate and equity. There are a number of informal conversations happening between states, including with Nevada. So that's amusing to me that you picked that one. And there are a number of other bodies seeking to support this. Atlas Public Policy has some really interesting intersections. And of course, Esri, our mapping partner in all this work, has a lot of kind of publicly accessible maps and dashboards that allow you to look at Justice40 and look at kind of what's happening in your state and what's happening in other states and start to have a compare and contrast. So there is just a ton of conversation happening as we seek consistent guidance from our federal partners. I think one of the things that Lashelle mentioned is that the guidance is rolling out dribs and drabs from federal agencies to their state entities and to people in states. And the inconsistency of that guidance is very complicated. So we continue to support the federal government as it brings all that guidance together and has a single unified definition for disadvantaged communities. At the same time, we're talking to other states about how they're managing that.
I feel like the my biggest takeaway from this program is going to be how lucky we are to have so many smart people in so many different roles across the country, thinking about how to really bring an equity lens to this work that we're doing, that is absolutely imperative to address the climate crisis and to address environmental injustice, and that we're only successful in that if we do so while advancing equity as well. That I'm going to be floating high all day with that realization. And then, of course, there's this flip side of like, are there people who are looking for ways to get out of this? And so one of my questions is, does that 40% of investments or of investment benefits, or benefit investments, whichever way we're smushing those words together, does that apply? Is that an umbrella 40%, or is it 40% of each and every program? And the reason I'm pushing on this is, is it possible that you say, well, 100% of the benefits of this program went to disadvantaged people, which means we don't have to even worry about it for this program over here. Or is there some mechanism to make sure it's a consistent commitment across all programs?
Yeah, so it is on a program basis. So 40% of the investment benefits from a covered program. So if an agency says we have a lot of water funding, they can't say 40% of that water funding went to disadvantaged communities. They have to drill down into the program, which is why the Office of Management and Budget required them to identify all of the programs in their suite that are covered, which basically just means Justice40 applies to the program. If it's a covered program, that means Justice40 applies to it. And then there is a covered investment, which just means like a federal investment that is defined as federal grants, other federal types of assistance, which includes loans, credits, guarantees, and direct spending. Other covered investments are direct payments to or benefits to individuals, federal procurement benefits, which mostly just applies to the federal government, programmatic staffing costs. So yeah, they really have been tasked with drilling down pretty far so that we can't just say we did a good job in this we did good job on climate, so leave us alone. No, you really have to go program by program, and then you have to know that it's a covered program, and you have to know that it's a covered investment. And yeah, that's the basis. So I don't think you can get one over on the White House on this one.
That is great to hear. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And this group, this audience, you all know very well how hard and long we have all worked together to get those monumental and transformative federal laws over the finish line. And this, now that we get to see the benefits starting to flow to states, and we see how we're going to work together to implement these programs and make sure that everyone is benefiting. It is just a really exciting moment. It's fun. It's really fun to make these big strides together and to be able to do it in a way that makes our community so much stronger. So, Lashelle, thank you so much. I just always appreciate your level of wonkiness and ability to translate to the rest of the world. So thank you. And Jess, thank you so much for joining us today and being able to share that Maine specific lens. It sounds like we all have some good follow-ups. You will all get that follow-up email later this afternoon. You'll find in there some links to that climate and economic justice screening tool, so you can see what the nationally consistent data tells us about Maine, and a reminder to stay tuned that we'll get some more specific to Maine information when the Climate Council's Equity Subcommittee makes its report early next year. Thank you all for joining us today. We will be off for the next 2 weeks, but we will be back in this space on, oh gosh, what is that date? October 14th. To talk about elections with the Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows. She is just a terrific champion for our democracy, and she'll be on hand to talk about election processes and voting rights and make sure we're all ready for the election day in November. Between now and then, have a wonderful, wonderful fall time, and thank you for joining us today.